Hello, my friends, and welcome back to Books and Gratitude, the place where we talk about stories that move us, haunt us, challenge us, and stay with us long after we turn the final page. I'm Shelley Meyer, and today we are stepping into a book that is dark, unsettling, claustrophobic, intelligent, and deeply unnerving, all in the best ways. Today's episode is all about The Standing Dead by WM Parslow. And let me tell you right now, this book is a 5-star read for me. If you love horror that does more than just try to scare you, if you love stories that understand the monster outside is often tangled up with the monster inside, and if you appreciate a setting so oppressive and atmospheric that it starts to feel alive, then this might be the book for you. So let's start with the premise, because this one hooks you immediately. We open with this chilling idea. Underneath the soil, where the bones of the hanged men stood in their upright, unmarked graves, blood diffused through the ground to reach them. And as it did so, something small and dark stirred among the dead. That is how you get my attention. That isn't just eerie. That's the kind of opening that tells you very clearly this story knows exactly what it's doing. It knows how to create dread. It knows how to suggest history, violence, corruption, punishment, and something ancient and wrong all at once. It's gothic, but filthy, historical, but immediate, supernatural, but rooted in human brutality. And then the setup deepens from there. We meet William Lees, who has been transferred to HMP Page, an old prison with old secrets buried beneath it, literally and figuratively. When a shocking act of violence occurs, something awakens, something tied to bloodshed, something that sees, something that thrives. And suddenly this becomes not just a prison story and not just a horror story, but a story about what festers in a place where violence has soaked into the walls, into the floors, into the history itself and the people. That concept alone is fantastic. But what really makes The Standing Dead work is that it doesn't stop at the concept. It follows through. This is one of those horror novels where the setting matters, the emotional undercurrent matters, and the deeper thematic work matters. It's not just simply asking, what if something horrible lived under the prison? It's asking what kind of place feeds horror? What kind of system breeds it? What kinds of men carry it? What happens when violence is not an interruption, but an actual environment? That's what makes this book feel so much richer than a basic creature feature or a standard supernatural thriller. Now, I want to keep this review mostly spoiler light because I think books like this are best experienced when you can slowly feel the walls closing in around you. But I do want to talk about why I think this novel is so effective and why it landed as such a strong 5-star read for me. The first thing I want to praise is the atmosphere. This book really understands atmosphere in a way that a lot of horror novels aim for, but don't fully achieve. HM Page doesn't just feel like a location, it feels like a pressure system. It feels like a place where the air is stale with memory, a place where suffering has sediment, and it's a place where whatever happened there before never really stopped happening. Prisons are already inherently claustrophobic settings. There's confinement, surveillance, routine, threat, institutional control, suppressed rage, isolation even in crowded spaces. There's already something psychologically suffocating about that environment before you add anything supernatural. And The Standing Dead uses that brilliantly. The prison setting doesn't just frame the horror, it really intensifies it. Because where do you go when you're trapped already? What does escape even mean when the bars were there before the monster arrived? And what happens when you're dealing with a threat that's not only physical, but moral, psychological, and historical? The setting creates dread before the plot ever needs to announce it. And I love horror that trusts its setting enough to do that. There's also something especially powerful about the oldness of HMP Page. This isn't a sleek modern place. This is a place with rot in its foundations, a place where the past hasn't been buried so much as covered over. That matters because horror often works best when it taps into the idea that evil is cumulative. Places can be shaped by what's done there, what has been done there. That trauma isn't always gone because it's no longer visible. And this novel seems to understand that on a very, very deep level. Then we get the second major strength, which is the book's understanding of violence. And I want to be careful with how I say this, because I don't mean that the book glorifies violence. Quite the opposite, actually. What I mean is that the novel seems to understand violence as a force, as something contagious, escalating, and dehumanizing, as something that leaves residue, as something that can become ritualistic inside certain systems, and something that damages not only the victim and perpetrator, but the entire environment around them. That is such a compelling framework for horror. The Standing Dead is described as a tale of monsters, both those under our beds and those in our heads. That line feels absolutely central to why this story works. The supernatural threat may be terrifying, but it isn't separate from the human threat. It grows in the same soil. It emerges through the same bloodshed. It's not disconnected from human cruelty. It's actually fed by it. That's smart horror, because the scariest books are often not the ones that present evil as random. They're the ones that present evil as cultivated. That's what makes a story linger. A jump scare can startle you. A creepy image can unsettle you. But a horror novel that suggests violence calls to violence, that pain opens doors, that institutions, houses are something monstrous because they have long made room for monstrosity. That this kind of horror that gets you under your skin. And The Standing Dead sounds like exactly that kind of book. I also really appreciate the character lens of William Lee's at the center of all of this. A prison setting automatically raises questions about guilt, punishment, coincidence, identity, survival, and what people do when they're reduced to the worst thing they've done, or the worst thing someone believes they've done. In a setting like this, a protagonist doesn't just move through the plot, he moves through judgment. And that's really fascinating, because if a prison forces you to face your demons, as the premise says, then adding a literal or supernatural evil creates a layered confrontation. You're no longer just dealing with fear. You're dealing with fear sharpened by self-knowledge, regret, anger, shame, denial, or even trauma. In great horror, external danger often exposes internal fracture. It's never just about whether the character survives. It's also about what the character recognizes in himself while trying to survive. That kind of storytelling gives horror a lot of weight. Without that inner dimension, horror can become mechanical. Scary things appear, people react, bodies drop, the end. But with that inner dimension, horror becomes personal. It becomes moral. It becomes psychologically alive. And from the premise, The Standing Dead seems deeply, deeply invested in that richer territory. And another thing I love is the title itself. The Standing Dead is such a strong, evocative title. It instantly creates imagery. It's unnatural. It's memorable. It feels historical and mythic at the same time. It suggests punishment, unrest, bodies denied peace, and something unresolved in the land itself. And it also feels metaphorical, which I always appreciate, because in a story set in a prison, who are the standing dead? Is it the buried men? Is it the inmates? Is it the guards? Is it anyone trapped in cycles of violence or dehumanization? Is it a whole institution that keeps moving while spiritually hollowed out? A good horror title should pull its weight, and this one really does. Let's talk tone for a moment now, because tone is everything in a book like this. Based on the premise and the emotional shape of the story, this feels like a novel that isn't interested in cheap thrills. It really feels deliberate, oppressive, almost sinister and thoughtful. It feels like the kind of book that lets dread accumulate rather than rushing past it. And I personally love that. I love horror that's willing to sit in discomfort. I love horror that doesn't rush to explain itself too quickly. And I love horror that says, no, stay here a moment. Listen to the creaks in the walls, smell the damp earth, feel the dread in your chest, and understand that this place is wrong long before the plot started. That patience creates immersion, and immersion is what makes a horror novel memorable. When a horror book is working, you don't just read it, you inhabit it. You start anticipating the next page with a mix of excitement and reluctance. You know something bad is coming, and you still keep going. That tension between curiosity and dread is the magic trick of horror. And it sounds like The Standing Dead pulls that off. I also want to highlight something that really matters to me as a reader. The best horror stories usually reveal something true about humanity. Not flattering, not comforting. It's true. And one of the truths horrors can reveal better than any other genre is that fear doesn't create people. It exposes them. It strips away performance. It reveals what they worship, what they excuse, what they can survive, what they become, and what they're willing to ignore when life felt normal. In a prison setting, that becomes even sharper because prisons are spaces where power is concentrated, where vulnerability is weaponized, where hierarchy is constantly negotiated, where violence is both threat and language. That means every supernatural element in a story like this lands in an already morally charged environment. It's not horror floating in a vacuum. It's horror pressing on existing fault lines. And that gives The Standing Dead its edge. It doesn't sound content to merely frighten. It wants to disturb. It wants to interrogate. It wants to force the reader to consider where evil begins and how easily it's fed. That is one reason I'd call this a 5-star read. Not because it's comfortable, not because it's fun in a breezy sense, but because it sounds purposeful, crafted, resonant. The kind of book that knows horror is most effective when it's saying something even while it's terrifying you. So let's talk about the image of blood reaching the dead beneath the soil. That image is incredible. Why? Well, because it collapses the distance between present violence and buried violence. It actually suggests that what's happening now is not separate from what happened before. The past isn't gone. It's being nourished, reawakened, invited back. That is such a potent horror image because it captures one of the genre's deepest fears, that the past is never truly the past. We all like to imagine that time moves neatly forward, that secrets stay buried if no one speaks their names, that places can be cleaned up, repurposed, renamed, modernized even, and therefore redeemed. But horror knows better. Horror says the house remembers, the land remembers, the body remembers, the institution remembers. History doesn't vanish because it's inconvenient. And The Standing Dead appears to build that idea directly into its bones. That makes it not just scary, but thematically satisfying. Now, who is this book for? I would say this book is for readers who enjoy dark horror, psychological horror, supernatural horror, and possibly readers who appreciate a touch of folk horror energy as well. In the sense that the land and the dead and the hidden history all matter and are all tied together. It's for readers who want menace and meaning together. It's for readers who like stories where the supernatural threat is inseparable from human corruption. And if you love horror that's grimy, tense, intelligent, and morally unsettling, this is a great pick for you. If you want horror drenched in atmosphere, this is a great pick for you. If you enjoy prison set stories where confinement becomes part of the terror, this is a great book for you. If you want clean-cut heroes and simple answers, probably not for you. If you want a horror novel that feels like it has dirt under its fingernails and history in its teeth, then yes, absolutely yes, this is for you. And I think that's part of what makes this book stand out. A lot of horror fiction can feel interchangeable after a while. Different monster, same structure. Different setting, same emotional beats. But The Standing Dead has a premise with identity. It has a title with identity. It has a setting with identity. And it appears to know exactly what kind of story it's telling. And that confidence matters. You can feel when a horror novel has conviction. You can feel when the author isn't just borrowing familiar genre tools, but actually building a whole emotional architecture around them. And this book feels like it understands that horror, and it's not just about fear. It's about consequence, inheritance. It's about contamination and what rises when blood is literally and metaphorically. That's why a book like this can appeal even to readers who don't always read horror. Because at its best, horror is never only horror. There's also character study, social commentary, emotional evacuation, philosophy with a pulse, and history told through dread. And The Standing Dead seems to tap into the larger power of the genre. I also want to say something about the phrase, something that has seen Lee's. That's kind of terrifying because being seen in horror is often worse than being chased. To be seen means to be recognized, marked, known. It suggests that whatever has awakened isn't mindless. It's aware, selective, intentional. There's something deeply unnerving about a force that doesn't simply exist but perceives, especially in a prison where surveillance is already built into daily life. The idea of being watched by the institution, by other inmates, by guards, by your own conscience, and now by something old and blood-fed beneath the ground. That is definitely chilling. It adds an almost intimate layer to the fear. It's not just that horror is near, it's that horror has noticed you. And that detail alone makes me want to keep reading. One of the things I admire most in dark fiction is restraint. The willingness to let implications do some of the work. The trust that readers will meet the story halfway. And from the language of this premise, I get the sense that WM Parslow understands that beautifully. There's poetry in the darkness here, not prettiness, but precision. Kind of language that gives a story texture and menace at the same time. That matters so much because horror lives or dies on language. You can have the best concept in the world, but if the writing doesn't carry dread, if it doesn't build tension, if it doesn't make the reader feel the walls or smell the soil or sense the wrongness, then the story never fully comes alive. But when the language is doing its job, horror becomes immersive in a way few genres can match. And that's what this seems to deliver. Let me put it this way. This book sounds like the kind of horror novel that understands fear is not only about what leaps out at you in the dark. It's also about systems, memory, rot, complicity, power, blood in the ground, bones in the walls, violence that doesn't end when the moment does. That is lasting horror. That is the kind of horror that follows you after the book is closed. And for me, that is exactly what earns a 5-star review. Not perfection in some abstract sense, but impact, originality, atmosphere, thematic depth, a clear sense of purpose, and an emotional and psychological aftertaste you can't shake. The Standing Dead sounds like a book that earns its dread. So yes, this is a 5-star review from me. I love horror that is willing to get ugly to tell the truth, that knows the monster is rarely just the monster, that makes the setting part of the haunting. I love horror that understands buried things don't stay buried just because someone wants them to. And I especially love books that remember darkness is most powerful when it reveals something about us. Now, before I close, I want to take a moment for something I always try to hold on to here on Books and Gratitude, and that is gratitude itself. When we talk about dark books, unsettling books, frightening books, it can sound strange to end in gratitude, but honestly, I think this is one of the most meaningful places to practice it. So today, I'm grateful for writers who understand that stories can take us into terrifying places and still give us something valuable. I'm grateful for horror that doesn't numb us, but wakes us up. I'm grateful for books that remind us evil often grows where pain is ignored, where history is buried, where people stop seeing one another as human. And I'm grateful for stories that make us look more closely and make us think more deeply and come back to the light with a little more appreciation for mercy, compassion, and truth. I'm grateful for imagination. I'm grateful for brave, strange beauty of horror. And I'm grateful for every reader who chooses to sit with a story long enough to let it change them. If you've read The Standing Dead by WM Parslow, I would love to know what your thoughts are. Did it haunt you? Did the setting get under your skin? Did the themes hit hard for you as horror did? And if you haven't read it yet, but you love dark, intelligent, atmospheric horror, this one is a book worth picking up. Thank you so much for spending time with me on Books and Gratitude. Until next week, take care of yourselves, hold close the stories that move you, and remember to find gratitude even in the shadows, because sometimes the darkest stories remind us most clearly how precious the light really is. Please remember to like and subscribe if you haven't already, and share this review with someone you think will enjoy it. Thank you, and have a great weekend.